If you come into Wolfenstein Youngblood looking for more of the brutal and chaotic combat that you'd find in its most recent predecessors, then you'll likely find the early hours of the game fairly satisfying. However, once the gratification of mulching Nazis with a various array of weapons wears off, Wolfenstein Youngblood ends up feeling less like a worthwhile standalone title, and more like a slapdash DLC expansion with little to really offer. The game is set 20 years after the events of the New Colossus, after the Nazi forces controlling much of the world have been pushed back, and BJ Blazkowicz has settled down to raise his two twin daughters, Jessica and Sophia. After BJ's mysterious disappearance, however, it's up to the two teenagers to track him down and possibly save him in Nazi-controlled Paris. Youngblood's plot is serviceable, but it isn't particularly engrossing, thanks in large part to the amount of plot-irrelevant stuff you have to do for the majority of the game. Much of Wolfenstein Youngblood is spent working for the French Resistance, doing a bunch of busy work, while the plot itself kind of dies after the opening cutscenes and doesn't pick up again until the final act. The main characters, namely the twins and their companion Abby, are endearing and fun enough to spend time with, but they just don't get to do much that feels particularly relevant, you know? After such entertaining romps as Wolfenstein The New Order and The New Colossus, it's hard to look at this and not feel like it comes up lacking. To its credit, Youngblood does look and sound the part more often than not. Its character models look fine, though the designs are either lifted straight from the previous Wolfenstein games or look kinda bland, especially in the case of the two playable characters and their featureless supersuits. The environments fare a bit better, often featuring plenty of fairly detailed nooks and crannies to explore, though the above-ground areas of Nazi-controlled Paris do tend to feel a bit samey after a while. On the other hand, the game's sound design is solid across the board, with impactful gunfire punctuating the chaos of most battles, and alternate history German pop songs selling the setting as well as they did in the previous two games. The game isn't without some weird technical hiccups though, of both the audio and visual variety. In the realm of audio issues, it wasn't uncommon for entire sound effects to go missing during particularly intense moments, whether we're talking gunfire, explosions, or warning sirens, and few things take me out of a shooter more than seeing my gun fire with zero noise accompanying it. On the visual side of things, it was pretty common to experience inexplicable frame rate drops during cutscenes, and albeit much less common, at time of writing the final boss fight could be near unplayable at times on the PS4 due to some weird and incredibly hard to ignore glitch that would just make the skybox constantly flash white. But as I said, the more severe of these issues was isolated entirely in the final boss sequence and wouldn't always trigger, while the noticeable cutscene frame rate issue didn't really affect my enjoyment of the game all that much. However, what did affect my enjoyment of the game was the repetitive nature of Wolfenstein Youngblood's core gameplay. You spend most of your time running missions for the French Resistance, which generally involves killing Nazis and completing objectives in one of the game's handful of hub worlds. These levels are fairly open and offer plenty of opportunities to explore, and most of the available missions will send players to most corners of these maps, but I can't help but shake the feeling that this structure absolutely demolishes any sense of pacing that most Wolfenstein games have. The open nature of its levels and the non-linear approach to its missions means that you're constantly stumbling into respawning patrols in these hub levels, and Youngblood's leveling system means that you're going to be doing a number of these side missions to make sure that you aren't grossly underpowered for its small handful of core missions. In the game's defense, you are able to tackle its hub levels with a stealthy approach, in addition to the more common guns blazing technique, which lets you spice up the constant forays into Youngblood's more open levels. With that said though, trying to be sneaky is often more trouble than it's worth, thanks in large part to the constant presence of Nazi drones hovering overhead. That's not to say that the stealth mechanics aren't fun and functional, especially in Youngblood's more linear stages, but in the hub worlds it feels pretty pointless, especially when you consider that any enemy spotting you results in an almost immediate alarm. Thankfully, the gunplay is just as solid as it ever has been, although the Nazis you'll find yourself coming up against certainly feel more durable than those in the New Colossus or the New Order. Enemy difficulty levels are denoted alongside their health meters when you aim at them, which is a decent way of discerning whether you're ready to attempt a particular area or mission, but it all just feels like artificial padding. There's no difference between a level 5 enemy and a level 35 enemy beyond the fact that the latter can deal and take a fuckload more damage than the former for no apparent reason. And you can't even over-level your character and turn the game into a cakewalk either, since most enemies' difficulty levels scale alongside you. You do have access to some light RPG mechanics to boost your defenses and damage output a little bit, but when the game is constantly scaling Nazi difficulty alongside you, the game ends up feeling super unrewarding. It is possible to melt enemy life bars by using an appropriate weapon against their armor type, but with some of the more powerful enemies, the difference seems negligible. You'll just end up unloading all your ammo into them for a good 5 minutes straight, which is boring as hell. Now, the biggest addition to Wolfenstein Youngblood does mitigate the enemy's bullet sponginess a little bit. By introducing a co-op partner into the mix, you're able to focus fire and bring down tougher enemies a little faster, but the game's co-op comes with its own issues. For starters, there's no split-screen co-op, meaning that you need to access 2 individual copies of the game, or a deluxe version of the game that allows a player with a trial version to accompany you on your Nazi-killing quest, and honestly, I don't think Youngblood is good enough to warrant spending any more money on the game than the bare minimum. In addition to the lack of split-screen co-op, Youngblood also lacks any reasonable difficulty scaling for lower-level players. To test the co-op function out, I had my girlfriend jump into the game with me while I was around level 20. Needless to say, a level 1 character coming up against level 20 enemies was not a fun time for either of us. Ultimately, the game's co-op feature doesn't really feel necessary either. Beyond having doors that require 2 people to open, there's very little in the game that requires 2 human players, aside from the final boss, and the co-op negatively impacts Youngblood's functionality as a single-player game more than anything. You can't pause the game regardless of whether you're playing online or offline, and the AI partner that you get while playing offline doesn't really do much. They stick too close to you to be able to draw aggro effectively, and if you're trying to stealth your way through an area, you'll be doing it all on your own. Finally, the game just doesn't have much in the way of content to actually entice you to play through it. The plot is pretty bare bones, its gameplay is repetitive, and the only in-game rewards on offer are gun upgrades, which aren't particularly exciting, and skins, which look like trash. The game also features microtransactions that allow you to buy these skins without searching every inch of the map for in-game currency, which is kind of scummy, but as I said, the skins look like trash, so there's not much point in trying to get them. The game does have plenty of side missions to do, I guess, but they lack any plot significance, and most of them feel like glorified fetch quests into the same old areas, populated by the same old enemies. With all that said, Wolfenstein Youngblood is bad. With its fun story and characters and satisfying gunplay, Wolfenstein Youngblood starts off strong, but it's only downhill from there. The plot all but disappears until the game's final hours, its satisfying gunplay only gets less satisfying as the enemies become more and more durable as the game progresses, and I was starting to tire of the game's repetitive structure and lack of interesting places to explore long before Youngblood's abysmal final boss. Meanwhile, the prospect of having fun with a friend is heavily diminished by the lack of split screen as well as its tacked-on nature. It just doesn't feel very necessary. If you're dying to scratch that Wolfenstein itch, then Youngblood will get the job done to some degree, but man, I'd just suggest going back to play the new Colossus or something.